everyone. We're continuing with the 9th chapter of the Treasure of Alpheus Winterborn. Anthony was able to get his wood chip into the cellar door of the Winterborn house, although he was seen by Mr. Loomis, but Mr. Loomis knows him because he frequents his father's cigar store and has even offered to give Anthony a tour. Days passed. October turned into November. Now that he had set things up for the big break-in, Anthony was developing cold feet. It was one thing to stick a piece of wood in a door, and something else to be a real-life burglar. Night after night he walked home from the library. Anthony thought, I could do it now, I really could, but then he would say to himself, no, it's not late enough. Old Eagle Eye will be awake. She'll see. Besides, I need to have tools. I need a mallet, a chisel, and some other stuff. He could have gotten these tools from his dad's tool chest in the garage, but he hadn't gotten around to taking them. He would make other excuses to himself, excuses of all kinds. Then he would bite his lip and call himself a coward because he was afraid of Old Eagle Eye. He began to think that maybe he would never get up the courage to do what he wanted to do. Late one cold November night, Anthony lay awake in his bed. Downstairs his folks were arguing, the old familiar scene. For a while the arguments had stopped because Mr. Monday had been too sick to stay up late at night. But now his health was returning, and that was one of the things that tonight's argument was about, Mr. Monday's health. Mr. Monday was planning to open up the store again, whether Doc Lucier gave him the go-ahead or not. Anthony lay there, wide-eyed, listening to the battle. He began to torture himself with accusations. As far as he was concerned, this fighting and bickering was his fault. If he had only had the guts to go down and get that treasure out, they would be rich and everything would be fine. After all, the burglary was all set up. All he had to do was push a door open and walk in. But he just couldn't force himself. He was scared of getting caught. The argument was over. Anthony could hear chairs scraping around as folks were coming up to bed. The shelf clock in the front hall struck 11, then 12, then 1, but Anthony still lay there motionless, wide awake under the covers. Then with a sudden motion, he flung back the sheet and the blankets. He sat up, swung around, and put his feet on the floor. He padded noiselessly over to the closet, put his shirt and pants on over his pajamas, and laced up his tennis shoes. How he managed to get down to Front Street, Anthony never remembered. It was as if the whole thing were happening in a dream, as if some force outside himself were moving him around from place to place. All he knew was that some time after he got dressed and slipped out of the house, he was down on Front Street and crouching behind a bush in the side yard of the old Winterborn place, shivering with the cold, and he was mad at himself because he hadn't brought any tools with him. His heart was beating fast, and his body felt prickly all over. His blood was pounding in his ears. He felt very strange, but he was there. He was at the house. That was all that mattered. As for the tools, men had been working in the house, and they had probably left some lying around. If not, he would dig the treasure out of that wall with his nails if he had to. Anthony crouched there, staring at the cellar door. He could see it clearly by the light of the street lamp. Behind him was the house of Old Eagle Eye. It was completely dark. Anthony felt his body grow tense. He clenched his fists. He stood up and started walking across the frozen grass toward the house. He walked with swift, resolute strides. He was almost there. And then something happened. Anthony heard a loud barking noise. A growling dog was rushing at him. It had leaped out of the doghouse that stood near the back porch. The doghouse that was supposed to be empty now. Anthony screamed, "No, no, help!" Then he turned and ran for leather across the backyard of the Winterborn house and across Mrs. Specie's backyard. Suddenly, as he was about to cross to the sidewalk that ran from Mrs. Specie's back door to her garage, his feet flew out from under him. He felt as if someone had grabbed him by the ankles and flipped his legs upward. He fell onto the sidewalk, which was sunk between two banks of grassy earth. He fell awkwardly with his right arm pinned across his belly and his left hand thrust out to break his fall. He landed with a sickening thud and lay there in a daze. His body stung all over. The heel of his left hand was scraped, and it burned like fire. Warm blood was oozing out of it. In the distance, the dog was still barking. Anthony shook his head and groaned. He felt sick. Then he tried to raise himself on his right arm, but the arm wouldn't move. The dog went right on barking, but it didn't follow him. It was a stray that had crept into Prince's old doghouse to get out of the cold and was trying to defend its right to stay. Anthony didn't know that, of course. He was bruised and shaken and scared and cold and shivering. Using his left hand, he dragged himself to his knees. He shook his head groggily and looked around. Up above him, at the top of a low bank he had just fallen down, was a wire. It glimmered faintly in the light of a distant street lamp. A tripwire. Mrs. Specie had rigged it up because she had gotten tired of having kids cut across her backyard. Anthony staggered to his feet. He put his left hand under his right forearm to hold it up. He had the very strange and terrifying feeling that if he took his hand away, his right arm would drop off. He looked at it as if he had never seen it before. It still seemed to be attached, but it was useless. It wouldn't move, and a dull pain was spreading through it. He shook his head groggily. The dog barked some more, louder now, and then a light came on the upstairs window of Mrs. Specie's house. Anthony was so shaken and confused that all thoughts of burglary and treasure had been driven right out of his mind. All he wanted to do was get away from Mrs. Specie's house before she discovered him. As he stumbled up the second bank, checked to make sure there wasn't a second tripwire, there wasn't, and walked quickly out to the sidewalk, across the little side street, then across Front Street to the park. He started trotting along one of the long diagonal walks that crossed the park. Confused and jumbled thoughts were running through his head. What am I doing out here anyway? I must have been out of my mind. This is all a weird dream. I'll wake up any minute now. Wasn't it funny about that dog? What the heck was he doing there? There wasn't supposed to be any dog in that doghouse. Maybe they left him behind when they moved. A sharp pain shot through his arm and shoulder. The pain cleared his head. It shook him out of his dreamy, numb state. It shook him out of the dreamy, numb state he had been falling into. He had better go get help. Now, as he began to get his bearings, he realized that he was closer to Mrs. Eel's house than he was to home. He started walking faster. He walked from one pool of lamplight to another, and dead leaves scuttled past him as he went. He crossed the park and started up Hannah Street. He was headed toward Mrs. Eel's house now. His arm burned and he felt feverish. Now the dreamy state was coming back. All sorts of weird fantasies flitted through his mind. He wondered if gangrene setting in? Will they have to cut my arm off? He had watched westerns on TV where men had their legs cut off. They always gave them whiskey to drink and made them bite hard on pieces of leather. A vague terror began to grow in his mind. Would his arm be all right? He walked on through the silent streets, holding his arm carefully in front of him like a parcel. When he got to Mrs. Eel's house, he went up on the porch and rang the bell. He rang it 3, 4, 5, 10 times, pushing the button hard and holding in for a long time. "Oh, please answer, Miss Eels," he sobbed to himself. "Please be there. Please be there. Oh, somebody do something. Please do something." The porch light went on. He heard Mrs. Eels fumbling with the lock. Then the door opened and Mrs. Eels was standing there in her bathrobe and slippers. Her glasses were stuck crookedly onto her nose. She looked crabby at first, as people often do when they have just been awakened. But then her mouth dropped open. "Good Lord, Anthony, what are you doing here at this hour?" My arm," stammered Anthony. His eyes were stinging. "I think I've broken my arm." And that is the end of chapter 9.